The North American Free Trade Agreement marked its 24th birthday to start 2018. The big question is, will it see its 25th? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe for Unpublished Ottawa. I'm Ed Hand. While U.S. President Bill Clinton and Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien signed the agreement to take effect in 1994, NAFTA's origins go further back. Ronald Reagan introduced a North American Common Market as part of his 1980 election campaign. NAFTA started as a free trade agreement between Canada and the U.S., and in the early 90s, then-President George H. Bush brought Mexico to the table, which has led to the current agreement in place. The North American Free Trade Agreement has been a political football for many politicians, in particular U.S. presidents, as we've seen since Donald Trump entered the presidential race in 2015. While it decries the deal as unfair to Americans, the agreement has accomplished its 7 goals. Under Article 102 of the NAFTA agreement, there are 7 specific goals. Grant the signatories most favored nation status, eliminate barriers to trade and facilitate the cross-border movement of goods and services, promote conditions of fair competition, increase investment opportunities, provide protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights, create procedures for the resolution of trade disputes, establish a framework for further trilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation to expand the trade agreement's benefits. Despite ringing the bell on all of these, U.S. President Trump wants it renegotiated or has threatened to pull out altogether. To get an idea how much this means to all North Americans, in 2016, trilateral trade reached nearly $1 trillion U.S., more than a threefold increase since 1993. 400,000 people and over $2.4 billion worth of goods and services cross the Canada-U.S. border every day. Since 1993, Mexico-Canada merchandise trade grew 9-fold, while services trade has increased 6-fold. Negotiations have been going all week in Washington, with the U.S. pushing hard for an agreement soon before the Mexican election on July 1st and the U.S. midterms. While there's considerable hand-wringing over NAFTA, one group suggests that Canada should not be pushed into a corner making a hasty decision. Scott Sinclair is a senior economics researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and he joins us on the Unpublished Cafe. Now, Scott, in terms of the policy alternatives and you and your commentary in the tyee, are you against NAFTA or just a hasty decision?
Well, I think that there's certainly a possibility to replace NAFTA with a better arrangements. NAFTA has failed in many respects, and that's part of the reason that we're in the situation that we are today, is that Trump has exploited that anxiety on the part of U.S. workers. But right now, I mean, we're faced with a situation where Canada is being pressured to meet U.S.-imposed timelines to do with their own internal fast-track situation and congressional approval. And in my view, we're just not close to resolving the key issues, and that Canada should not be bullied into a short-term agreement.
You mentioned possibly replacing with a better agreement. What about NAFTA, from your perspective, failed, and what would you like to see make it better?
Well, I mean, one element of NAFTA that certainly failed Canada is its investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, where we've been the most sued country, and we've seen attacks on our environmental protection laws and regulations, such as the recent Bilcon case, which is in my region of the country, where a NAFTA panel sided with a U.S. investor against an environmental assessment review. And now we face potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. But you know, there are many new issues now on the table. If the U.S. wants Canada to align its intellectual property rules with theirs, and that could cost Canada billions of dollars. If we lock ourselves into the wrong kind of digital trade rules, that could undermine our privacy rights. And innovative Canadian firms. There are issues around supply management, which are well known. Our dairy farmers are, very nervous. So, there's also some opportunities. I mean, there's an opportunity to get rid of investor-state dispute settlement in this round of negotiations. There's an opportunity, particularly if we wait for a new Mexican government, to strengthen the labor aspects of NAFTA and put a floor under wages and the right to organize, which just hasn't existed in NAFTA up till now, in Mexico up till now.
From your perspective, why do you feel it's impossible to reach a deal between all three countries on the U.S. timeline?
Well, I just think the gaps are too large at this point, Ed. I mean, there are just too many outstanding issues, whether it's around intellectual property, where they don't even have a common consolidated text as they call it yet. Government procurements, they're very, very far apart. It looks like they're making some progress around auto rules of origin, but not everything is going to fall into place simply if they resolve that issue. So, I mean, what the U.S. wants essentially is an agreement in principle on their terms, and I don't think it would be in Canada's interest to go along with that. And as I said, the gaps are so large, it's hard to imagine that it's achievable in the next week or so.
Yeah, as we find out this morning, Paul Ryan says he wants this in place by May 17th, and from your perspective, obviously not realistic. No,
I don't think it's realistic, and he's even said, they would need a full text. Congress would need a full text. So, the timelines under the U.S. Fast Track Authority are very structured, and the chances of, even if Canada were to agree to a hasty deal, of this actually being passed this year are slim and close to vanishing. So we would just tie our hands in the negotiations, and it would be all for naught, I think.
Scott Sinclair is joining us in the Unpublished Cafe, a senior economics researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, as we discuss NAFTA and the accelerated timeline to get it done. And from your perspective, what should Canadian workers be concerned about if a rushed agreement is agreed to?
Well, I've mentioned dairy farmers, for example. Certainly their livelihood is on the line. In integrated industries like autos, obviously, the wrong kinds of rules could really put Canadian plants at a disadvantage. I think that Canadian citizens and consumers have to think about the kind of the structural issues as well. I've mentioned investor-state dispute settlement, and which affects our right to regulate, which after 20 years, there's lots of evidence that was a mistake, and this is a chance to correct it. The intellectual property rules are very important for things like the federal government's pledge to put in place a pharmacare program. It could be a lot more expensive if we knuckle under and adopt U.S. style rules. It could cost us billions of dollars, and it could. The wrong types of rules can affect the innovativeness and competitiveness of Canadian cutting-edge tech firms and R&D. So, again, this is not the kind of thing you want to rush into.
Well, when you talk about the rules and the regulations, U.S. President Trump wants to reduce regulatory burden. Are you concerned about that, or is that the direction you'd like to see?
No, I am quite concerned about it. I mean, basically, he's got the Environmental Protection Agency, or had his appointee, Scott Pruitt, do that. And I'm a bit concerned that Canadian negotiators are somewhat too open to that agenda. And the next, I guess you would say, wave of restrictions being negotiated in international trade agreements are around something called regulatory cooperation, and it's basically kind of an early warning system for foreign corporations to interfere or get wind of planned regulations that harm their interests. But those are public protections, and we need the balance that a democratic system and proper oversight and public debate give us in making those regulations around key issues like climate change and others.
I wonder, Scott, has the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives taken a look at what would happen to the Canadian economy if NAFTA fails?
Yes, we have looked at that, and many others, including Canadian banks, have put out studies. And if Trump went through with his threat to withdraw from NAFTA, which is starting to look less likely, I have to say, but if he did, it wouldn't be the law of the jungle. We would revert to WTO tariff rates, and reverting to the WTO tariff rates, we've calculated would be equivalent to about a 1.5% tariff on the value of Canadian exports. So that's a disruption for sure. It will hit some sectors harder than others, the high tariff sectors, but it would be manageable. And I would have to say we're gratified that there have been many subsequent studies by the Bank of Montreal and others that have the IMF have come to the same conclusion, that it would be disruptive but manageable.
You know, when we look at this, Canada, the U.S., the Mexican economies are all intertwined with this North American Free Trade Agreement. But if it fails, how do we untangle that?
Well, we don't have control over what Donald Trump does. I mean, what we have to do is approach this negotiation in the spirit of getting the rules right, and I think it's certainly far better to take more time to do that than to rush into a bad deal, which could leave us worse off than if he pulls the trigger on NAFTA.
If you mentioned the WTO tariffs, but if Trump withdraws from NAFTA, what chance do you see of the old Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement coming back into effect, the one from 1989?
I think it's slight. It's I guess you could say it's technically possible. But if his administration revokes the NAFTA or rejects the NAFTA, many of the same elements that they object to, such as the dispute settlement mechanism for around countervailing duty and anti-dumping actions, U.S. trade remedy actions, are also in the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So it really would just trigger another set of negotiations, perhaps bilaterally between Canada and the U.S. So, no, I don't think that's a feasible option. I think what we'd be looking at would be reversion to WTO rules.
All right. Well, Scott, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Okay, my pleasure, Ed. Good talking to you.
I'd like to thank Scott Sinclair of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. You can hear the clock ticking on the U.S. pushed deadline to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. If the deal disintegrates between the three countries, it will have a broad economic impact. And to get his perspective on the size of the impact and whether NAFTA can be saved, I'm pleased to be joined by Matthew Stewart. He's the Director of National Forecasting at the Conference Board of Canada, who authored a report on the fallout of NAFTA. Thank you for joining us, Matthew.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad you could join us. Can Canada financially survive the end of NAFTA?
Sure. The impact isn't going to be, it's not going to drive us into recession, but it is going to have a pretty significant impact on the economy and on economic growth and our competitiveness.
How is it going to impact the competitiveness?
Well, when you think of the impact on the economy, most people think of, well, we're not going to be able to export to the United States. But that's only part of the impact. When you take an example, you look at the autos and parts, and we export a significant amount to the United States in autos and parts. But in fact, only a fraction of that is produced in Canada. A lot of that, the supply chain impacts, we import from the United States. So it would have a huge impact on the cost of all of those imports and make us a lot less competitive for our exports to the United States and also to the rest of the world.
What kind of job losses would Canada possibly be looking at?
Well, according to our estimates, we think we lose about 75,000 jobs during the first year. So, a significant impact, but it's not enough to drive us into recession. I think the real impact is around our competitiveness, which affects our long-term wage growth and how much income the average households earn.
Now, in terms of competitiveness, when we have this North American Free Trade Agreement, is that maybe a sign that Canada needs to trade with more countries around the world?
Yeah, that's one of the solutions. We've got to focus on our other trading partners. Export more into China and more into Europe, and that's why we see more trade agreements. But the fact of the matter is that most of our trade, more than 70% goes to the United States. So it's hard to fight that when our largest trading partner puts tariffs on. It'll hard to offset that impact.
Matthew Stewart is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. He's the Director of National Forecasting at the Conference Board of Canada as we discuss NAFTA and possibly the end of the agreement. And, Matthew, first off, we talked about automobiles and auto parts and such, but what products do you see the impact immediately being hit in terms of price if NAFTA fails?
I think the largest impact would be autos and parts. Mm-hmm. What we expect would happen is if NAFTA breaks down, we would see a return to the tariffs that are under the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the tariffs for motor vehicles and parts that Canada goods would face going into the U.S. would be a little less than 3%. So it doesn't seem, overwhelming. But all of the supply chain goods that come into Canada from the U.S. that would face tariffs of just under 5%. So that would make us, less competitive. It would challenge our ability to trade. So it would have a significant impact. Motor vehicles and parts would be the biggest impact because the supply chains are so integrated across the border, but also things like chemicals, other manufactured goods, consumer goods, all of those would have pretty significant impacts.
What's the impact on foreign investment?
Well, that's one of the key areas that our economy would see a hit. When you look at the Canadian economy over the last couple of years, one of our biggest challenges has been attracting investment into Canada. Investment is actually still down about $46 billion from the high that we saw in 2014. So we're already having challenges attracting investment, and the insecurity around NAFTA is one of the key reasons for that. So if NAFTA were to collapse, that would be one of the long-term impacts, would be our inability to capture more investment, because a lot of the companies that do invest in Canada invest because they see it as an attractive place to get goods into the United States. So all of that would be at risk.
Yeah, you mentioned the insecurity regarding investment in Canada. Why would there be the insecurity? Because it looks like Canada just can't live up to an agreement?
Well, just because there'd be so much, especially at first, there'd be a lot of insecurity. Okay, what exactly the tariffs that we would face? And it's not just the return to the World Trade Organization tariffs. That I think companies could deal with that in the short or in the long term, but it's also all these extra tariffs that seem to be announced recently. Like President Trump announced a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% on aluminum. And this just creates further insecurity that maybe there's more tariffs coming. And this just adds to the insecurity and makes us less of a source for investment dollars.
Now, what about domestic investment? If foreign investment is on the decline here, do you see domestic investment on the decline as well?
Well, yeah, we do actually a survey of large Canadian companies, and we ask them for some of the reasons why they're not investing in Canada, because investment has been down in recent years. And, some of the reasons that they've give are that they're worried about access to U.S. markets, that also that the U.S. is a more attractive place to invest, that some of the labor costs in the United States have declined. And these are all factors that we're going to have to fight, if it looks like NAFTA is going to collapse.
With NAFTA, we've had, obviously the economies are integrated. We've got a lot of intertwined economies. We've got a lot of temporary workers crossing the border, services going across the border. What's the impact on that if NAFTA fails?
Well, that's first on employment. That's a big uncertainty. I'm not quite sure how it's going to affect employment, but we'll have to see what kind of agreement takes its place. Whether we get sort of a half NAFTA, or as they call a zombie NAFTA, which is it's not quite defeated, but it's not quite there, and we'll have to wait and see exactly what takes its place. And I think it's this insecurity that also has a large impact on the Canadian economy.
In terms of the Canadian economy, obviously we've got provinces here. Who's going to take the brunt if NAFTA fails?
Well, it'll be widespread across, all of the provinces, but the largest impact will be Ontario. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is, then the auto industry is largely in Ontario, and that's the largest industry that's going to face declines in the event of a NAFTA collapse. So Ontario would see the largest impact, but other provinces would also see substantial declines.
From your perspective, how optimistic are you NAFTA will survive?
Well, economists don't agree on a lot of things, but I think the benefits of trade are clearly one of them. So I find it hard to believe that we would let an agreement that has so clearly benefited both countries, disappear. So I am optimistic that we will see NAFTA survive. But I got to say the news isn't great. We sort of follow the Twitter account on a daily basis to see what's going on. So there is a huge amount of risk. And I think we're still far apart on a lot of the key areas of disagreement.
Matthew, I want to thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.
Matthew Stewart is the Director of National Forecasting with the Conference Board of Canada, and they did the report on the impacts on the Canadian economy if NAFTA doesn't survive. As mentioned, we all started hearing about the demise of NAFTA. Where else? On President Trump's Twitter feed, quote, worst trade deal in the history of the world, and, quote, the greatest disaster trade deal in the history of the world. But is it? According to the Trade Leadership Coalition in the U.S., 14 million jobs are supported through NAFTA. The U.S. exports twice as many vehicles than before NAFTA was signed. The U.S. had a $23 billion trade surplus in goods between the two partners, Canada and Mexico. And with those kind of numbers, you think the man behind the art of the deal would be on side. Well, to get some more perspective south of the 49th parallel, I'm pleased to be joined by Jamie McInerney, Executive Director of the Trade Leadership Coalition. Thank you for joining us, Jamie.
Pleased to be with you, Ed.
Maybe first off, you can just explain what the Leadership Coalition is.
Yeah, you bet. This is a group of industries and associations that understand the importance of international trade and want common sense rules and agreements in place that help facilitate cross-border commerce that creates new business opportunities for businesses throughout North America and throughout the world, and also very importantly, lowers prices for consumers.
Which industries make up the coalition?
It's a broad group of industries, every sort of sector you can think of, manufacturing, energy, technology. It's a wide-ranging group of folks.
All right. From the perspective of the coalition, how well has NAFTA been at job creation in the U.S.?
Well, as you said in your lead-in here, 14 million jobs in the U.S. depend on NAFTA. That's a very important number that can't be dismissed. I think when you drill down into the supply chains of key group industries like the auto industry, you quickly realize that a car, say, produced in Mexico actually has usually somewhere around 40% U.S. content in it. So, by just looking at sort of the gross total numbers of exports, you miss sometimes a little bit, the nuance that goes into that, which is that, our North American economies are really linked together, and exports from one of our countries actually stimulates job creation across all three.
From U.S. President Trump's perspective, though, it sounds like America has been getting the shaft in this agreement, and obviously you don't see it that way. What's his end game here? Well,
they're, as I'm sure your listeners know, urgently working towards a NAFTA 2.0 agreement. All of the lead negotiators are in Washington, D.C. this week. So we will see where those discussions progress. I know there has been some, the reports out of the ongoing meetings are that there has been some good progress made, and we will see if the agreement can be modernized. I think what our perspective is, importantly, is that a NAFTA 2.0 deal should add to the existing success of NAFTA by updating it for the 21st century, but it should not put in place sort of increased protectionist measures or anything that would fundamentally disrupt the success that we already experience.
And what kind of an update would you like to see?
Well, there's certainly, the agreement was negotiated over 25 years ago. So, one area that springs to mind is the energy. In the last few years, Mexico has sort of reopened its energy industry for international investment. They had a constitutional reform that, and NAFTA was, or energy was purposely left out of the initial NAFTA because of, the Mexico's sort of closure to foreign energy companies. Now that that's happened, that's a huge opportunity. The energy resources that are being produced in Canada and the U.S., some of those reserves sort of extend right across the border into Mexico, and U.S. firms really are well placed to operate there by including the Mexico and the energy chapter in NAFTA, and by doing things like ensuring that the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism remains in the agreement. That will, stimulate, economic activity in the energy sector across, all three countries, really.
We look at prices and buying power for American consumers, and if NAFTA comes to an end, what happens to those?
Yeah, I think that's a very troubling scenario. Consumer prices for everything from automobiles to fruits and vegetables are impacted by NAFTA in a positive way for consumers. The ability that Mexico has growing seasons throughout the year, whereas the northern United States and Canada only grow certain fruits and vegetables once a year. So the fact that we can get fresh strawberries in February is at an affordable price is a testament to the benefits of it. And if the agreement were to go away, you would quickly see prices increase for a lot of different goods. One study that the Trade Leadership Coalition did in partnership with the Center for Automotive Research found that if the proposal put forth by the USTR for automotive rules of origin could actually increase the cost of a car by over $2,000. Those are real dollars for consumers, again, across all three countries.
Jamie McInerney is joining us. He's executive director of the Trade Leadership Coalition in the U.S. as we talk about NAFTA. And Jamie, how does NAFTA make the U.S. more competitive globally? And is that message getting through at Washington?
Yeah, I think that's a really critical point, Ed. The idea that the U.S. could somehow, bring back sort of all this production and all these jobs that folks talk about and do it all in the U.S. Is really a misnomer. North America itself is a competitive region for producing all sorts of things. And again, automobiles is a great example. There are a lot of foreign auto companies that come to North America and set up production to serve this market and to export to other markets simply because Canada, the U.S., and Mexico linked together are so effective and economically competitive at producing, a complicated good like an automobile. If we were to sort of tear apart those linkages, I think most economists will tell you that one of the biggest impacts will be that some of that production will leave North America altogether, and that is, I think, antithetical to the goals that the administration is trying to achieve.
Security seems to be a big concern of the U.S. president as well, and this agreement, which I don't think he's really realized yet, does boost national security for the U.S., does it not?
Oh, absolutely. There's fantastic cross-border cooperation on security issues, specifically related to the shipping industry. A lot of things enter North America at various ports of entry, some from Canada, some from Mexico, some in the U.S. And by working together, we're able to make sure that those what comes into this continent is safe and secure, and also as it crosses our borders internally here.
We talked about the car industry, and that seems to be one of the big issues that they're having. All three are having trouble getting to. Mexico has moved a bit today, but there doesn't seem to be enough movement. It just looks like the U.S. wants more than it already has, and is it asking too much?
Well, yeah, I'll reference again that study that we did with the Center for Automotive Research. Mm-hmm. It found that the U.S. auto proposal, which is on the table right now, could suscept up to 87% of vehicles produced in the U.S. to tariffs. As we try to export them, which is a huge amount of the current automotive sector, and it would potentially reduce auto sales by up to 150,000 cars. And again, this is the opposite impact of what the administration says it's trying to achieve. So, I think there has been some compromise, and I'm hearing that things are potentially headed in the right direction on the auto rules of origin issue, but I think the USTR needs to, do some real sort of economic analysis about what it is proposing. Frankly, we haven't seen that, from the USTR. We've seen what they've proposed, but we haven't seen a real justification for why. And I hope that they will look closely at that and closely at our study and think about what the impacts might be.
I'm kind of interested in what the coalition thinks about this deadline. It seems the U.S. is pushing to have this done before, obviously, the Mexican presidential election and the U.S. midterms. And then Paul Ryan comes out today and says, I want it by May 17th. One, is that even realistic? And two, why the rush?
Well, so there's if you're going to pass a NAFTA 2.0 deal through the U.S. Congress, the normal way to do so would be through Trade Promotion Authority, and that law dictates clear timelines for when things need to be signed, introduced to Congress, and studied, and then voted on. And I think the deadline that Paul Ryan put out there is about achieving the deadlines laid out in TPA in order to have a vote this year. And that would occur most likely during December. So I think the reason he put that out there is to achieve those deadlines. That said, I think most of the folks negotiating this and most of the stakeholders involved realize that speed can't be the enemy of the good here. We have to ensure that we get a good and properly negotiated NAFTA deal, if indeed we do, and not one that is done hastily. So, I think the fallback scenario here could be that this negotiations gets pushed out a little bit longer, but they make sure that they get a deal that is going to be constructive.
If NAFTA comes to an end, what impact do you foresee on the U.S. economy? We already talked about the increase in prices, but what other impact do you see on the U.S. economy?
Yeah, so we did a study of this. We studied the perceptions of Wall Street analysts on what NAFTA does and what it means, and we interviewed about 100 of them, and the results were stark. All of them foresaw lower job growth, lower GDP growth, and the greatest beneficiary of a no more NAFTA would be China. So I think it's pretty clear that NAFTA really does help the U.S., and to withdraw from it would be terrible for our economy, for our equity markets, for jobs and employment, and so there really would be dire impacts. And I think the president is starting to understand and realize that.
Jamie, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ed. It's been a pleasure.
Jamie McInerney is the executive director of the Trade Leadership Coalition, a group of industries and organizations who support continued American trade leadership and its many benefits for U.S. consumers. Now, sand is draining through the hourglass as time appears to be short to save the North American Free Trade Agreement. U.S. House Speaker Paul Ryan announced he wants that deal in place by May 17th so it can be voted on in December to give Congress a chance to pass it. The biggest stumbling block appears to be what the U.S. wants in terms of automobile manufacturing and what others are willing to concede. This coming week will be crucial to whether NAFTA will live to see its 25th year. Thanks for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. For Unpublished Ottawa, I'm Ed Hand.